Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. And today I'm going to be talking about some underrated Victorian books that I think you'll like if you like specific well-known Victorian books. I'm trying to work out a concise way of explaining this. I have no idea what I'm going to call the video, but what I'm going to do today basically is go through some very, very famous Victorian novels and then some very unfamous Victorian novels that I think you'll like if you like those very famous Victorian novels. So what I did was I went to Goodreads and had a look to see what the Victorian novels with the most ratings on Goodreads were, which was really, really interesting actually. Like, Jane Eyre has more than double the amount of ratings of the Dickens book with the most amount of ratings, which I am surprised at. Like, I wouldn't have said that. And then stuff like, I know Trollope is not like as well known as Dickens, but like no Trollope book has more than 15,000 ratings, which really surprised me. And then even like the difference in ratings between certain Dickens books, like some Dickens books have like 600,000 ratings and some have like 10,000, which is just a really, really huge difference. And I know there are some Dickens books that are much more famous than others, but it was just really, really interesting to see that. That's a tangent. As I was saying, what I did was go to Goodreads and I picked 14 Victorian novels that I have read that have a lot of ratings on Goodreads, and I have matched them with other Victorian books that I have read that I love that have not very many ratings at all. Some of them are not very many ratings, like 30,000 in comparison to 300,000, and some of them are not very many ratings, like 88 ratings. Now, these 14 books that are my starting points for, like, if you like that, you might like this. They're not necessarily like the top 14 most rated Victorian books on Goodreads, because there were some of those that I couldn't think of anything that else like it from the Victorian period. For example, like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I mean, I can't think of anything else like it. It's just so bizarre. So anyway, let's get into the point of this actual video. Starting off with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which has 1.4 million ratings on Goodreads. This is the most rated Victorian book on Goodreads. And if you liked Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, I would highly, highly recommend Olive by Diana Mullet-Craik, which is very underrated and has 88 ratings on Goodreads. And this is a fantastic book. It makes me really sad that it only has 88 ratings on Goodreads. That is not enough. This book is amazing. This book, like Jane Eyre, is a builder's romance following a young girl from a difficult childhood into an adulthood where she comes into herself, finds out more about herself, comes of age, and learns that she deserves happiness despite the fact that she doesn't have a physical appearance which is considered the ideal by Victorian society. Quite similar in premise, if you put it that way. The main character in Olive has a physical deformity. There's something wrong with her spine, which means she doesn't look like the other women around her. And this means from an early age, Olive is kind of told by people around her that she's never going to get married, she is never going to have children, she's not going to have the lifestyle which is considered to be the ideal for women in the Victorian period, and therefore she goes and does something different with her life. And along the way, we meet all of the people she encounters. And we also watch Olive learn to believe that she does deserve happiness, even though the society around her is telling her she doesn't, which is something that you have a little bit of in Jane Eyre. Like, Jane Eyre is not conventionally pretty, and one of the really important things that I love about Jane Eyre is that Jane Eyre is like, just because I'm not beautiful doesn't mean I don't deserve happiness and doesn't mean I'm not a good person. And Olive kind of takes that more steps further and looks at it in even more detail. There are many differences between these books. Jane Eyre is very gothic, Olive is not very gothic, but I think if you like Jane Eyre, you'll love Olive because it has so many of the same themes in terms of like self-identity, coming of age, learning to believe in yourself and learning to believe that you deserve happiness. There's just, I think, a lot that these books have in common, and I think if you like Jane Eyre, you will really love Olive, and Olive is just amazing and I just want everyone to read it, so yeah. These two, good pair, highly recommend. Next up, I have Wuthering Heights with 1.2 million ratings on Goodreads. And if you like Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, I would highly recommend Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Lorna Doone has 14,000 ratings on Goodreads, so definitely not as underrated as Olive, but I don't hear people talk about it very much, and certainly not as many ratings as Wuthering Heights. It has been a long time since I read Lorna Doone, probably about 11 or 12 years, so I am a little bit rusty on its details, but Lorna Doone is a fantastic book. It is a historical Victorian book, so it is set a few hundred years before the Victorian period, and it follows a love story between two people who are kind of on different sides of this feud. The reason why I recommend it as being quite similar to Wuthering Heights and a book that you'll enjoy if you like Wuthering Heights is because, like Wuthering Heights, it is full of drama and passion and violence. It is full of very, very complicated family politics. It's really exciting, really dramatic, a real page turner, and just, yeah, a fantastic book, one that I would highly recommend, especially if you liked Wuthering Heights. Next, I'm combining two books here. One is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which has 850,000 ratings on Goodreads, and also The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which has 330,000 ratings on Goodreads. And if you like both of them, or either of them, I would recommend one of Elizabeth Gaskell's novellas called The Poor Clare. This has 317 ratings on Goodreads, so definitely underrated. So The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde both deal with like people who are sort of split in two in a way. A Picture of Dorian Gray follows a young man called Dorian Gray who has a portrait painted of him and makes a kind of bargain that everything bad that he does will show on his portrait rather than him. He never ages, his portrait ages, his portrait shows all the badness in him. And then there is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which follows Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, who are one person kind of split in two, and Dr. Jekyll kind of becomes Mr. Hyde, who is this kind of like animalistic, violent version of himself. The Poor Clare by Elizabeth Gaskell has a kind of similar premise at its heart. We follow a young man who falls in love with a woman called Lucy, but soon discovers that Lucy is kind of followed around by this sort of mysterious demonic doppelganger of herself. Lucy is all sweetness and kindness and light, and then the demonic version of Lucy is all like cruelty and demonicness and badness. And it's really interesting, I think, to compare The Poor Clare to these as a kind of like female version of that. I will say about The Poor Clare, it's got a slightly weird structure where we follow like the backstory of the plot before we follow the main story of the plot. So do persevere through the first chapter because it gets really good from like part two, but the beginning is a bit weird. So just, yeah, bear on with that. It is underrated, it is really good, but you need to get through the first chapter. Next up is Dracula by Bram Stoker, which has 800,000 ratings on Goodreads. And if you like Dracula, or if like me you were quite disappointed by Dracula, I would highly recommend Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. This is the best known and best loved of my underrated recommendations here. Carmilla has 33,000 ratings on Goodreads, which is quite a lot, but it is obviously still very underrated in comparison to Dracula, and in my opinion the much better vampire novel. Carmilla follows a young woman called Laura, and what happens when another young woman moves into their house to live with them called Carmilla. And Carmilla is a bit creepy and a bit mysterious, possibly a little vampiric, but she also kind of is incredibly captivating, and Laura is very, very drawn to her. Carmilla has like quite heavy lesbian undertones. There's definitely like a romanticization and a sexualization of the friendship between Laura and Carmilla, which is fascinating, and also it's just a great vampire novel. Really, really well done, really fascinating, so gripping and powerful, a fantastic gothic book, one I would highly recommend. Like I said, if you enjoy Dracula and want to read something a bit different, or if like me you found Dracula a little bit disappointing, then Carmilla is fantastic. Next up, Great Expectations, which has 600,000 ratings on Goodreads. Would you think The Great Expectations would have less ratings than Dracula by that amount? I'm not sure I would have done, but there we go. And if you like Great Expectations, I would highly recommend The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy, which has 3,200 ratings on Goodreads. Thomas Hardy is obviously a very famous Victorian writer, but some of his books are really, really not well known at all, including The Hand of Ethelberta, which I think is a fantastic book and really, really interesting in terms of the way it looks at class. So Great Expectations, if you don't know, follows a young boy called Pip as he grows from his childhood into his adulthood. Pip is from a very working class background. He expects to be a blacksmith. He is training to be a blacksmith when he is told that he is going to inherit a lot of money, and kind of ends up in a very, very different life, being a gentleman, pretending that his background isn't really working class, and kind of living a sort of double life, struggling to cope with all the people he left behind who are his old friends and family but of such a different class to him. The Hand of Ethelberta follows a woman called Ethelberta, who is from a very working class background. Her parents are servants, but she is quite clever. She becomes a governess and then ends up marrying a very wealthy man who dies shortly after the wedding, and so she therefore ends up being this incredibly wealthy widow in London society, really sought after. Everyone wants to marry her. But she needs to hide from everyone the fact that her parents are servants, because they'll never look at her the same way. Like at one point she goes to a dinner party and her dad is the butler and and she's like just trying to pretend that she doesn't know him. It's so clever, it's so interesting, and really, really fascinating, like Great Expectations, in terms of class and looking at social mobility and the kind of hypocrisies of class within the Victorian period. Definitely a book I would recommend, and definitely of interest if you loved Great Expectations. Next up is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This has 450,000 ratings on Goodreads, so quite a lot. And there are two other Christmas stories I want to recommend if you liked A Christmas Carol. One is actually another of Dickens's Christmas novellas, and that is The Haunted Man. This is a fantastic Christmas novella that I really highly recommend, and if you like Christmas Carol, you'll really love The Haunted Man. And it only has 970 ratings on Goodreads, and that might be slightly misleading because it's not very long, so it probably exists in collections, so people might have rated it as part of collections, but I still feel like it is really little known in comparison to A Christmas Carol and really forgotten about. The Haunted Man, its full title I think is The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain. Basically, this man who is kind of haunted by grief and struggle in his life makes a deal with a ghost who is kind of like the ghost of himself, which is cool to begin with. He makes a deal that he will forget all of the suffering in his past, but the moment he forgets all of the suffering in his past, he also loses his ability to empathise. And when he talks to other people around him, he kind of spreads this forgetting of past struggle, which means that other people around him start to lose their ability to empathise with other people. It's so fascinating. It's such like a fantastic premise. It's just, yeah, absolutely fantastic. And then the other Christmas story I would recommend is Christmas Storms and Sunshine by Elizabeth Gaskell. This has 33 ratings on Goodreads. Again, like The Haunted Man, it probably also appears in collections, so I feel like that might not be actually accurate of how many people have read it, but it's such a good story and it's really little known. And it follows these two families who live in the same building, but the men of these two couples work for like opposing newspapers, so they have like a war going and they really hate each other. And yet this particular Christmas season kind of brings them together in the most glorious way. It's really, really good fun. Very, very Christmassy, a short story I would highly recommend. Next up, I have The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This has 370,000 ratings on Goodreads, so it's pretty well known. And this follows a man who gets in a time machine and travels to the future and sees what it's like. And if you enjoyed The Time Machine, I would highly recommend a very underrated book by Richard Jefferies called After London or Wilde, England. This has 564 ratings on Goodreads. I studied this at university and it was a really interesting one to study. It, like The Time Machine, is a Victorian science fiction novel, and it looks at this point in the future from the Victorian period after London, when kind of climate change and disaster has kind of changed the world so that it's gone back to being a really like feudal society. So it's kind of like a medieval quest narrative in some ways, but it's also set in the future after kind of the Victorian period and the Victorian society has kind of collapsed. So it's really, really interesting and definitely one I think you'll enjoy if you like The Time Machine. Next up is Tess the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This has 220,000 ratings on Goodreads, so you can really see the difference between Tess the D'Urbervilles and The Hound of Ethelberta in terms of what Thomas Hardy is really well known and what Thomas Hardy is almost not known at all. Tess the D'Urbervilles is a fantastic novel, and if you enjoyed Tess the D'Urbervilles, I would highly, highly recommend Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is a fantastic book. It has 6,000 ratings on Goodreads, and it's just amazing. So Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Ruth have a kind of similar setup. Both of them follow a young woman who, through kind of being deceived, ends up being a kind of fallen woman within Victorian society and kind of being judged because of that, and her life being affected because of that, and ending up as well kind of concealing her past from the people around her. But the reason why I love Ruth so much, and why I would really recommend it in comparison to Tess of the D'Urbervilles, is because Ruth is a much more positive book. I think I've said before on this channel that Ruth is Tess of the D'Urbervilles written by someone who had hope in humanity. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a very, very tragic book, and while Ruth has elements of tragedy in it too, it also is much more uplifting, I think, than Tess of the D'Urbervilles, with many more people who are willing to really help and really love Ruth, despite the fact that she is a bit of an outcast from Victorian society. It's such a fantastic book. Really, really highly recommend it. Next up is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This has 185,000 ratings on Goodreads, and if you liked David Copperfield, I would like to recommend Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells, which has 365,000 ratings. Obviously, I've already mentioned H.G. Wells in his capacity as a well-known Victorian writer, but one of the things I find very interesting is that for many Victorian writers, they have a few books that are very famous and a few books that are really forgotten. H.G. Wells' science fiction is remembered a lot, but actually his non-science fiction is not remembered as much, even though I actually think his realist books are much better. Love and Mr. Lewisham is really, really interesting. It tells the story of a young man called Mr. Lewisham who is from a kind of lower middle class background and trying to better himself, and kind of how his romantic relationships get in the way. The reason why I say that this one goes quite well with David Copperfield is that both of them look really interestingly at class. David Copperfield in this book kind of occupies various different classes. He goes from being fairly kind of lower middle class to working class to lower middle class again to kind of upper middle class to lower middle class. He moves around a lot within the class structure, and he kind of tries and fails to get respectability in certain ways. And in Love and Mr. Lewisham, it's quite similar. Mr. Lewisham kind of hovers around different areas of the class spectrum and kind of tries to raise himself in life, but kind of struggles and goes up and down and struggles financially a lot. And I find that really, really interesting, and the way both of these books look at class and also the relationship between like the particular romantic relationship or marriage you might choose and how that will affect your class and your financial prospects are really, really interesting. Next up, North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This has 130,000 ratings on Goodreads. By far this is the most rated Gaskell novel. A lot of her other books are way, way down and quite underrated, so that's quite interesting to see as well. I would highly recommend all of her work. She is a fantastic writer. And if you like North and South, I would highly recommend The Half Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury. The Half Sisters has 54 ratings on Goodreads. Like, it is so underrated. The Half Sisters is a fantastic book that follows two half sisters who don't know that they are half sisters. They share the same father, they've had completely different lives. One of them has a very working class background and ends up becoming an actress, which is very unrespectable within the Victorian period, and the other follows a very middle class woman who takes this kind of very middle class respectable Victorian lifestyle, except that actually the respectability of the middle class sister and the absence of respectability of the working class sister are perhaps not so set in stone as Victorian society might think. This is a fantastic book. It doesn't have like massively in common with the plot of North and South, which follows a young lady moving from the south of England to the north of England and kind of connecting with people in industrial Manchester. They have quite different plots, but I think they have similar writing styles. I think if you like Elizabeth Gaskell, you will really love Geraldine Dewsbury, because I think she explores similar themes with a similar writing style. And both these books feature female characters who are kind of behaving in a way that is not typical within the Victorian period and who kind of step outside of the social structure. And both these books look a lot at class and a lot at the divide between working and middle class and the ways that that is viewed by Victorian society. They're both such fantastic books and I would highly recommend them. Next up I have Middlemarch by George Eliot, which has 125,000 ratings on Goodreads, and if you liked Middlemarch by George Eliot, I would highly recommend He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope. He Knew He Was Right follows a young couple. They get married very early on in the book, and we follow the difficulties that they have in their relationship when the man begins to suspect that his wife is having an affair. But we also follow a lot of other different characters who surround them as well. The reason why I would really recommend reading He Knew He Was Right if you enjoyed Middlemarch is because both of these books look so fascinatingly at marriage and so fascinatingly at dysfunctional marriages that aren't quite working right and why that might be, and they look a lot at how kind of gender and power works within marriage. Both are really good books. I prefer He Knew He Was Right. I sometimes struggle with George Eliot's writing style, but I would recommend Middlemarch very much, and I do think if you found Middlemarch interesting, then some of Trollope's books, especially He Knew He Was Right, would be really fascinating for you, because Anthony Trollope, like George Eliot, looks fascinatingly at marriage and really picks it apart and explores marriages in trouble in such an interesting way. Would highly, highly recommend He Knew He Was Right. Next up I have The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, which has 120,000 ratings on Goodreads, and if you enjoyed The Woman in White, which is a fantastic like sensationalist gothic novel, I would highly recommend Uncle Silas by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. Uncle Silas has 5,000 ratings on Goodreads. It is underrated and it is amazing, and it is a brilliant gothic mystery like The Woman in White. The Woman in White, if I am remembering correctly, it has been more than 10 years since I read this book, follows a young man who is an art teacher who goes to stay in this particular house to educate these two young women in the art of drawing, and through staying with this family he gets caught up, and they all get caught up in some very complicated mystery going on to do with a particular woman in white. Uncle Silas, meanwhile, tells the story of a young woman who, through various circumstances, ends up getting sent to stay with her uncle Silas, who is quite a mysterious man. Many years ago, someone was killed in Uncle Silas's house, and everyone thought that it must be Silas who had done it, but the room was locked and there was no way of proving that it was Silas who ever did it. So perhaps it was someone else, perhaps the man killed himself. It's never really clear. Uncle Silas is supposed to be one of the first locked room mystery, but I would say that that's like not the most important thing in this plot, and it's less of a mystery and more of a kind of gothic sensationalist adventure full of melodrama and excitement, like The Woman in White, and also full of fantastic exploration of the way women were viewed in the Victorian period, especially the connection between women and madness was thought about in the Victorian period. And both of them as well have like really interesting female characters. So if you enjoyed The Woman in White, I would highly recommend Uncle Silas. It's a great book and a really good read. Then my final book for today is Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This has 120,000 ratings on Goodreads. And if you enjoyed Far From the Madding Crowd, I would recommend The Odd Women by George Gissing. This has 4,000 ratings on Goodreads, so a lot less well known than Far From the Madding Crowd. Both of these books are fascinating. They're very different in some ways. This is very, very rural and this is very, very urban. But I think they have quite a lot in common. In general, I would say that Gissing has a lot in common with Hardy. I've said before in this channel, I think of George Gissing as like the urban Thomas Hardy. His books have a really similar quality to Hardy's, where they deal a lot with people in difficult situations, people who don't have very much money, really struggling. Both writers write like really, really tragic but incredibly emotionally powerful books where characters get like so close to happiness and then there's like a little bit of happiness in the middle and then it's like broken apart. These two books are on like the more positive ends of their books. Not that that doesn't mean they don't have lots of sadness in them, but I think they work very well together, partly because of the way that both of them look at women working in the Victorian period. Far From the Madding Crowd follows Bathsheba Everdeen, who inherits her uncle's farm and who runs the farm despite the fact that she is a woman and competing with all of these male farmers who just don't really know what to make of her. And we also follow her kind of romantic relationships and the way the various men around her react to her. The Odd Women follows several women, including two who run a typing school to teach women to typewrite. They are trying to give women more options in life if they're not married. They're trying to teach some women that you don't have to get married if you don't want to, and there are other options in life, and that with the invention of the typewriter there are suddenly more options for women. You don't just have to be a teacher, there are other things you can do. Meanwhile, there is another strand with a woman who does get married and what her life is like. Both of these books look fascinatingly at working women in the Victorian period and look really interestingly at gender and power, dissecting the role of women in the Victorian period, and they both look really interestingly at marriage as well as an institution and the kind of power dynamics within marriage. I love both of these books a lot. I would highly recommend them. If you liked Far From the Madding Crowd, I really think you'll like The Odd Women, and even if you haven't read Far From the Madding Crowd, read this because it is fantastic, just like Victorian feminism in here. Fantastic. And that is all. I hope this video has been interesting and enjoyable and useful to get some lesser well-known recommendations off the back of some well-known Victorian books. I feel like this has been a longer video than I intended to be, so sorry for that. So yeah, please let me know down in the comments any other underrated Victorian books that you would like to recommend, especially if you compare them with a well-known Victorian read. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.